Well, good morning again. I'm going to ask you all to stand this morning as we read our scripture. We kick off in Exodus. Starting in verse 1, we're going to read through chapter 40 today. No, we're going to get through the first 14 verses. And here is what the word of Exodus tells us. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali; Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all, and Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. There's a line in the sand from the end of Genesis into Exodus. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." And so these two groups of people have been pitted against one another in the familiar epic that you see from Charleston Heston and all the other Prince of Egypt movies, parts that you're familiar with. And then in verse 11, "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with the forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly." Everybody say, "Work them ruthlessly," and have a seat. I like what you did there. Stan Lee. How many of you are familiar with Stan Lee? Two separate words. He was the creator and the developer of this niche book idea that later became a comic book and film empire known as Marvel. Who are the DC comic fans in the room? All right, so this didn't work out as well as I thought. Jennifer is definitely one, our bass player. She is a DC fanatic. We won't hold it against her. Stan Lee, he was known for creating characters like Spider-Man, the Hulk, Captain America, Thor, the Black Panther, and so many more. But as Stan Lee's comic books became one of the world's largest movie empires, he became known for something else. That almost as certain as the predictable storylines of the Marvel movies would unfold, Stan Lee himself would make some sort of cameo into his own movies. The creator would make a cameo. And that's really easy to pull off because if you're the creator, you can jump in front of the camera and pop into the story anytime you want, as anyone you want. Which should make us wonder, why did God choose to enter the human story when and how he did? I mean, Jesus, why is it significant that Jesus was born during the reign of a tyrannical king who ordered an infant genocide against all boys? And why did Jesus insist on being baptized and being baptized in the Jordan River? Why did Jesus' ministry begin not with preaching or miracle working, but with 40 days of temptation and testing as he wandered in the wilderness? Why did Jesus ascend a mountain near the beginning of his ministry and teach on the ethics of life in his kingdom that we know now as the Sermon on the Mount? And then why did Jesus, on the other end of his ministry, did he ascend a different mountain, one where his face began to glow with a dazzling nearness to God's presence? And why did Jesus time his death for Passover weekend? And why did he make such a big deal over that last Passover meal? I mean, if you're the Stan Lee of human history, you can make a cameo as anyone you choose at any time you choose, right? And if God's directing the story and planning on making an appearance, why now and why like this? And the answer to every one of those questions is Exodus. The Exodus story is referred to more than any other event in Scripture. The prophets, the books of poetry, the Gospels, and New Testament letters continually refer back to Exodus and the time that God showed us what he's like, when he revealed his character, when he told us his name. And so we're about to go on a journey through the book of Exodus. And next week, we're going to roll out to you a 12-week, verse-by-verse Bible reading plan that will go alongside our teachings. Teachings that will track through the major scenes, storylines, and themes of this epic, ancient story. But today, I simply want to set the stage for the journey we're about to go on. And let's start with this question. Why should I care about the Exodus story at all? And the answer to that question is Jesus. Because if you want to understand Jesus, you've got to understand Exodus. Exodus is the framing story behind Jesus' life and teachings that supercharged all of his life with cosmic significance. It was the power behind Thor's hammer. You can have a hammer, but without the lightning, that's not written, so that's a dead end. Reading and knowing Jesus' story without knowing or at least being familiar with the major movements and themes found in Exodus is kind of like listening to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech without any awareness of the transatlantic slave trade or that led up to the civil rights movement. It's like reading the diary of Anne Frank entirely ignorant of Nazi Germany. I mean, it's not useless. You can still be really moved by the words said and the words written, but it's also not charged with all of the meaning that moment or those words were meant to carry because you don't have the context for the moment. Exodus for Jesus is that. Exodus is the framing backstory that supercharges all the actions of Jesus with cosmic significance. Why should you and I care at all about the story of Exodus? Because if you want to understand Jesus, you've got to understand Exodus. But there's more. And watch how this builds out. If you want to understand yourself, you've got to understand Jesus. It's not just about understanding as if Jesus were a set of ideas in our heads. It's that you and Jesus are people to know. So if you want to know yourself, you've got to know Jesus. If you want to know who you are, you've got to know who Jesus says you are. If you want to experience joy and peace in the inner healing of your soul, you've got to know Jesus, who can give you life and peace and joy and the healing of your soul. If you want to live a life of generosity and purpose and meaning, you've got to know Jesus. Said a different way, if you want to truly know yourself, the origin point and the source and the power and the knowledge and the experience for all that comes from knowing Jesus. And we talk about life as a journey around here. And it is. And to some degree, it's a journey of self-discovery, of introspection, of working through your stuff, of looking inward and coming to terms with things and getting to the bottom of some of those internal fractures and questions and trauma and all the things. And that's real. And self-discovery is always part of the journey, and it's helpful. But self-discovery is ultimately incomplete without a greater God discovery. Meaning that for you to best know who you are, where you belong, and what you're meant to do, you must know God. Not just as an idea, not just as an ancient story, not just as the fulfillment of ancient prophecy, but as a person. And Jesus is that. Jesus is the relational bridge, the actual person to making that God discovery. Only in Jesus will you discover and experience the healing for your soul, find your true self, and live out your ultimate purpose. And so from one vantage, as you think about the story of Exodus through the lens that many of us are thinking about Exodus right now, as a people caught up in slavery, as this enemy, this arch nemesis is set up right from the beginning. The descendants of God's chosen people have now found themselves in captivity in Egypt, and Pharaoh wants to wipe them out, and he fears them. So as you see that, it's very easy to look at Exodus as a story about self-discovery and escape, about a guy named Moses and an entire people group known as the Israelites. And that's true, but it's only part of the full story. Because before any self-discovery, before any escape, before any reluctant leadership, Exodus is this. It's a story of a pursuing, loving, rescuing, covenant-keeping God who reveals himself over and over to his people and never leaves them. Exodus is about who God is. Exodus is about Jesus, and Exodus is about us. In that order. Why should you care about the story of Exodus? Because if you want to understand Jesus, you've got to understand Exodus. Exodus reveals to us who God is and who we are in relationship to his character in his cosmic drama. And so this morning, if you walked in here with any degree of journey wondering, what am I? Who am I? Why am I? Is there healing for my soul? Is there rescue for my scenario? Is there a way to life in the way that I long for life to be? Exodus, you'll find, may be a beautiful invitation into a continuation of that journey. A God who never leaves, a God who rescues, a God of justice, a God who puts his presence inside and among his people and makes a promise to them to never leave them, and a God that protects his people from his enemies. Today might be the beginning of a beautiful journey for you and for our church, because if you want to understand yourself, if you want to know yourself, you've got to understand and know Jesus. And if you want to understand Jesus, you've got to understand Exodus. So let me filter through all those mental imagery and the storylines and the popular scenes and movies of what Exodus is right now in your brain. How many of you are picturing Charles Heston out here, like when the Epic and the Prince of Egypt, which is one of the greatest soundtracks ever. How many of you are feeling that? Let's filter through that, and let me reintroduce you to Exodus a bit this morning. We'll start here that Exodus has 4 major movements: creation, enslavement, liberation, renewal. There is God's created people, the Israelites. They are God's creation. They are then enslaved by the tyrant king, the Pharaoh at the time. Then they are led to freedom, to liberation by Moses, very reluctantly and very dependent on God. And then they travel. They just go on the world's longest walkabout. For a long time, this wilderness season. We'll have a lot to unpack there together. This story, I want you to see it has a movement: creation, enslavement, liberation, renewal. And what happens in Exodus with the Israelites foreshadows and mirrors what happens in Jesus' life and through Jesus' life for us. Literary critic Northrop Frye once said that Exodus is the only thing that happens in the Bible. And I don't know that that goes far enough, because I think about my journey, and I think about the journey of you guys in our church and every human around us. I think Exodus is the only thing that ever happens, period. Creation, enslavement, liberation, renewal. We've been created by God, and we've been enslaved by sin and bondage and stuff. And we can be, and we are liberated by Jesus, our rescuer, and we are called then into this renewed, new way of living as the family of God. And in many ways, Exodus is like the Rosetta Stone that unlocks the story of Scripture in its whole, but it also unlocks a bit of your story and my story. Creation, enslavement, liberation, renewal. So Exodus has those 4 major movements, But in addition to those movements, Exodus itself, like the literal book of Exodus, it has a literary design, it has a literary structure. Exodus is part of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In Jewish tradition, Moses is viewed as the author of the whole Torah, including Exodus, but it's not super clear regarding Exodus because at the end of the book, the author talks about Moses' death, which would be pretty difficult if you're Moses and the author at the same time. Exodus is historical narrative, meaning there are times where it's hard to interpret. Is this like historical data among a real people group, or is this like a metaphor for a larger story? This is certainly a historical narrative. This isn't characters and myth. This is the story of an actual people in an actual place in an actual moment in time that's not just spoken of in the scripture, but it's corroborated by other primary source documents of its day, and then further confirmed through modern archaeological evidence. This story is told as the most significant event in the history of an entire people group, the Jewish people. And it's their Boston Tea Party, their Paul Revere's Ride, their Declaration of Independence, their Revolutionary War and Constitution all rolled into one, except it's about 1,000 times more significant. And if you would have practiced as a Jew Shabbat dinner Friday night as part of your Sabbath, part of that would have been to remember the Exodus, the freedom of your people from its captivity. This is as cornerstone a story to an people group and a building block into the gospel story as any story that is out there. And there are 5 major sections to this story. You're probably familiar with it, and this will be part of your breakdown in the Bible reading plan next week. But Israel is enslaved under Pharaoh. Then in chapters 5 through 15, we have the plagues. That'll be fun. This is the section where all the movies are made and the rescue stories and the epic crossing of the Red Sea. In chapters 16 and 18, this is that moment that's very human where like God rescues them from bondage and slavery and generations worth of oppression. They sing the first recorded worship song to God, and literally 8 verses later, they're complaining. This is where they start grumbling and whining, and they learn to be dependent on God, and they have that whole wilderness season coming up after there's the covenant made between God and Moses on the tablets, and the law is given at Sinai. And then there's just peak human expression, where they're like, thanks for the gift of freedom. We're really struggling to live this out. In fact, our past has such a grip on us, we don't know anything but to keep doing what we did. And they're just rebellious. But it's a lot like our rebellion. It's about, there was a way of life that is so deep inside of me that it's going to take a lifetime to mature and to grow and let God love and heal me out of. It is a beautiful picture of your struggle and my struggle, because it's our story. N.T. Wright says, he says it better, he says this, that there are 2 liberation journeys in Exodus. The first is to get Israel out of slavery. Second is to get slavery out of Israel. What we will find is not just cool kid stories and epic movies with scenes and plagues and nice little things to memorize for a head full of Bible knowledge, is that this is deeply ingrained to Jesus' story, the gospel story, and what it is to be a human, where we, as freed people, followers of Jesus, struggle to live free. That is Exodus. That is our story. That is the continuum of human struggle and pain and glory and victory that every single one of us are invited into and on. Where as followers of Jesus, we are freed people who struggle to live free. We are fully righteous in an instant, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to learn how to put that into practice and live it out. We are fully God's sons and daughter in an instant, and then we spend the rest of our life trying to learn what it means to be God's son and God's daughter. We are set up as co-rulers over God's creation, and then we learn what that means and try not to use it and lord it against people. We are set up to be loved by God and to love people, and then we spend the rest of our lives trying to drop the veil and invulnerabilities and shame and past regret, to be loved and then to give real sacrificial, vulnerable, gentle love to other humans. We are freed people as followers of Jesus, but we struggle to live free. That is the Exodus story. It's this long, slow journey to get internally free, to learn to live in that freedom. Reading parts of Exodus will be like the recovering addict sitting in his first AA meeting. The breakthrough has happened. It happened maybe by hitting rock bottom that put you in the chair in the first place. Brought him to the end of himself, where he finally, through helplessness and redemptive potential, uttered the words, "Help!" So he's there in the chair. And that's miraculous to begin with. But of course, redemption is not ultimately just sitting in the folding chair in some church basement AA meeting. Redemption is the life he's taking his first step towards by sitting in that chair. And that life is going to take thousands upon thousands upon thousands of steps of reformation and community and love and acceptance and being given belonging and resources and community that will take him slowly but surely on the long journey all the way from this help into freedom. From help to freedom. Pause. This morning, on the spectrum from help to freedom, where are you? Is this a day in vulnerability at the end of your rope, at the end of yourself, that it's the first day to sit yourself down in the AA chair of this community and say, help? And for others, is this a day where you need reminded, like the 20-year guy that's been at AA leading the group for 20 years who just says, we love you. Keep showing up. We're never leaving you. We will never forsake you. How? Because that's who God is. That's what God was like in Exodus. That's what Jesus is like, and that's what we found to be true. We're all on the long walk to freedom that the breakthrough moment made possible. Some days you need escape from the tyranny of the oppression of sin and powers of darkness. You need your Red Sea moment, and some days most of your life is actually not spent there. It's spent in the wilderness, learning to put into practice the freedom that you've been afforded. If you want to understand Jesus, we've got to understand Exodus. If you want to know who you are, you've got to know who Jesus is. If you want a framework for your story and for your enemy's story, for our community story, it's in Exodus: creation, enslavement, liberation, and renewal. I'm thankful this morning that God is still doing Exodus. Anybody thankful that God is still doing Exodus this morning? Like even now, Jesus is doing Exodus. It's what he always does. Except this time it's a little different. It's not just physical and temporary, but it's spiritual and it's eternal. And it's bigger and it's greater, and it's really a final retelling of the Exodus story we're about to walk through. Jesus casts himself in the role of Moses, but he's the greater Moses. The Creator stepped into history and he said, Moses was a prototype, but let me blow your minds of the real power of this redemptive story. You've been gathering around it to celebrate it, but you don't know it in the way I'm about to show you. You've heard of freedom of your ancestors. Now walk in freedom. Let that come alive in you. He casts himself in the role of Moses, and you and me are the people of Israel who are being liberated, not from physical labor, but bondage to sin and any trap of the enemy and culture and our flesh that enslaves us. And our enemy who isn't being defeated isn't a Pharaoh, it's not a tyrant king, regardless of what you think. It's not, and to the disappointment of the Jewish people at the time, it's not Rome either. It's just the enemy that is combating your soul. It's the culture that we're living in. It's the battle between our old life and the things that we thought we had put to bed, but they are not yet. It's our own sense of shame and worthlessness and value that has just been sabotaged by everything and every other voice than the one who redemptively called you to that chair and invited you into a journey that is your exodus. And the renewal to new life is not a physical movement from a literal kingdom into a desert and into the promised land. It's about entering into a new way of life in God's kingdom right here and now, a kingdom that will last forever. Jesus tells us in every detail of his life that he is doing a new exodus for all people. And Jesus shows us who God is. And that's really important because I think there are two ways that you and I can interact with this story. Because Exodus is like a set of glasses that makes Jesus clear. Exodus is like a set of glasses that makes us clear, our own story. It's like a set of glasses that helps us understand just the human struggle around us. And there's two ways that we can come at this story. And I'm not pitting one against the other, but I am saying there's maybe a healthier starting point for us. The first is that we can read and interpret and interact with this story from the vantage of the people. We can identify with their issues and their concerns and their struggles and their epic moments and their thrilling defeats, their wilderness season, their promise, their disobedience, but ultimately their deliverance. And you can look at it through that lens, and it has extraordinary value. But ultimately, that lens still leaves a little bit of fog in your lens. It's a little short-sighted, not because it's bad, but there's a clearer picture. And the clearer picture emerges when you look at the people's story and struggle through the lens of God's action, God's concern, God's pursuing love, God's rescue. When John brought up the prodigal son earlier, we almost always talk about the son, his actions, his failure, his coming to himself. But the hero of that story isn't that he got to the end of himself and he came back. That's beautiful. But the hero of the story is that there was a father who never gave up and loved and accepted and said, come on back. Drop the shame, drop the guilt. Let me heal you and free you, and you belong here among my people. The hero is God. In the Exodus story, this is not a story about a people who escape. It's a story about a God who rescues. A story about a God who never gives up. It's a God who provided for his people when through their own fogginess and stuff wandered about aimlessly, complaining for 40 years. All right, let me give you today's daily rations. I'm with you. Come to yourself. Be vulnerable. Put this stuff into practice. Live out your freedom. Remember your freedom. Do you remember your freedom? It was just then. Live it out. So I want to lovingly invite you from the forefront to interact with this story through the lens that you see God's action to his people first. His grace, his invitation, his promise, his covenant, his justice, his glory, his pursuit, his redemption. Focus on God. Because as I said, Exodus is not ultimately a story of a people who escape. It's a story of a God who rescues. And the core human struggle for you and I, as it was then, is that we will take God on his offer to help us escape, but forget to fall in love with the God who rescued us because he loves us. We will take the gift of God without being in love with him. And we're all on a journey, and that's what's so great about God, is he actually doesn't attach that string to it. But he does invite you into something deeper. And think it's the difference between living our life stuck day to day, grinding and struggling and striving and feeling empty and our identities being off in some wilderness season when there is a promised land just across the river that is in God's kingdom where we learn to practice the freedom that's already been given us. to habituate down into the depths of our healing, broken, fragmented soul and identity and sense of self and purpose, who God says we are and what his kingdom is about. And the key to that, finding that and living that in this story, is to look at God's action to you and to his people first before you see what the people cleverly did and figured out and escaped. Moses is a profound leader of his people, and there is so much we can learn and apply from that just at the level of leadership. But Moses was nothing without the God that assured him, because Moses wanted nothing to do with it. He was one of the most insecure leaders you could ever talk about, you could ever discover. And he celebrated today. He was supposed to be dead. He was cast in a basket in a river. He grew up in the enemy's house. And God used him to liberate his people. How could that happen? Because of God's action and God's concern and God's love and God's pursuit. Exodus is not a story about people who escape. It's a story of a God who rescues, a God who provides. The gospel, it is not about human success stories. It's about a God who rescues. And that's Jesus. So I end with this question and then a quick story. If that's who God is, then what does that mean for us? If Exodus is about a God who rescues, and we can't fully know who we are and why we are, and we can't fully even understand and interact and find the cosmic power behind Jesus' life and his actions without this story as the backdrop. If that's who God is, provider, healer, rescuer, redeemer, then what does that mean for me? What does that mean for you? And so as we pivot actually into our time of reflection, I want to invite you for a moment, and I'm not going to have you stand yet, but I want this to be running in the background of your mind for a moment. Take an inventory of your life for a second. Think about the needs that you're carrying, and the insults or the accusations and the attacks that you're feeling, the lack, just the sense of without. Think about the guilt and the shame that's rattling around your never shutting up mind. Think about the pain and the pain that's just stubbornly defining your present. Because if God really listens and God really cares and God really rescues and God really wants to set me free in the same way he set them free, and if this is ultimately about God's action first, if he really is defender, if he really is provider, redeemer, forgiver, reconciler, if that's who God is, what does it mean for you this morning, like now? A few years ago, went to South Africa and was able to go, fortunately, for a couple of years over the course of the summer. And was there as part of a team and some friends that are leading in a school there, and it's so much more than a school. They've taken in about 30 kids at this point, off and on into their home. Children who are HIV positive, children who have been abandoned, story after story of countless grace and God's pursuit. There's so many parallels here. But the first year I came, me and kind of the whole team just fell in love with this little girl named Lindra. And Lindra had just come into their home, like just weeks before. And Lindra was about 4 or 5 years old at that time, spoke no English, and had come from a village a little ways off. A pastor there basically discovered her abandoned by her parents, HIV positive, not getting the care that she needed. And he said, "Hey, I know your house is full, but can you take one more?" And they're like, "No, but bring her." And so they brought her. We came about 3 weeks later, and Lindra is just full of life, full of life. And in her eyes is that thing that children in those sort of scenarios experience, and there's this duality of just childlike innocence and light and just fear and trauma and brokenness all wrapped into this one, 60-pound 4 or 5-year-old package, about the age that my oldest would have been, actually. And if you've ever walked that journey of adoption or tracked with kids that has come from really traumatic backgrounds, you know that there is inevitably a part of the journey where they don't believe that this is true yet. What do you mean that I'm here maybe in a loving family where I can count on meals 2-3 times a day? What do you mean I'm not going to have to do certain things to be allowed to have rest and sleep? You mean you're going to send me to school, you're going to feed me meals, you're going to give me love, you're not, you know that story. And Lindra was in that boat, and we were there 3 weeks in. And Lindra, every night for those first 3 weeks, despite having meals every single day, despite having love and acceptance, would sneak into the kitchen in the middle of the night, and she'd scavenge. Just scavenge. I mean, she would eat them out of house and home all night long. She would develop a stash and put it under her bed so that if and when the bottom drops out, and this is too good to be real, this falls apart like everything else, these people, if they're like everyone else, I got to take care of me and take care of me now. And that's part of her journey. It was part of her journey. But that was over 10 years ago now. And Lindra has gone from a place of not believing the loving house that she was part of to being a full sister and daughter in this family, of being one of the ones who has welcomed more Lindras into her home, who has gone from trusting no one to trusting her family, to accepting God's love to her through the love of her human parents. She had been set free far before she knew it. And she had been set free because there was a God who worked through these parents to rescue her. And her life has not just been easy from that point. In fact, it's still so hard. Along with childhood trauma comes learning disabilities and physical things and a disease that she'll never be ultimately healed from. But there's something deeper than all of that, where she's learned to trust. She's learned to love. She's growing up into the person that is not defined by those things, but is defined by what Jesus says about her. And now she's about to graduate high school. She'll go off into college, maybe ministry school. And that's her story. And most of us in this room probably don't have that kind of early childhood experience. Some of you do. And regardless of where that starting point is, all of us are walking this journey with Jesus that is about believing and becoming the sort of free people that God has already done for us. Exodus is the human story. It's Lindra's story. It's your story. And it is the story that God longs for you and I to participate in so that more people who are yet to be set free, find home in God's family, can enter in. If Exodus tells us about a God who rescues, then what does that mean for me? What does that mean for you? So I'm going to invite you to go ahead and stand. And this is a moment for us as a church family just to undistractedly slow down and set our hearts on Jesus, to listen to the Spirit, what He may be saying to you, maybe a scripture He's drawing you to, or an encouraging word that has come to you recently that now is coming alive, or even an encouraging word that God would want you to give to someone right around you. Paul wrote in Galatians, he said that when the set time had fully come, God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. And because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father, the Spirit who cries out, Abba, Father. Why? So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has also made you an heir. We are not a people who escape. We are a people who God rescues. And so I want to invite you into a couple things this morning. I want to name a couple things that I felt this morning as I was praying in preparation for this conversation. And so if you're comfortable, would you take our posture that just closes your eyes and maybe extends your hands out? This is a posture of yielding, of surrender, but also to receive from God in this moment what he may be wanting to do in you. And the first invitation is to those this morning that feel like you're at the end of yourself. You're at the end of yourself. Your life has been marked by so much striving. Your life has been marked by so much trying to hold at bay the shame, the regret, and the pain that rules your inner life. For some, I think the invitation is to be like the guy who sits down in the AA meeting for the first time, where at the front end of his journey of redemption is this simple word, and it is help. Help. Who needs to say and ask for help this morning? For some, that help is like the ultimate help. Like, God, I'm at the end of myself. I need to take that step into what people call salvation. I need to take you up on your offer to freedom. I need to become who I've meant to be. I'm sick of running and hiding and questioning and struggling and doubting. For some, you cry help from your innermost parts, and this is the moment where God steps in. He renews your spirit. He makes you a new recreation, and he parks your butt in that chair and says, walk it out and do it with me. Do it with these people for the rest of your life. So if you're someone that needs to say help, just say it to someone, say it in your heart, say it out loud, whatever you need to do. For others, you've said that before, but your help means something different. It means, I don't know that I have the power to keep showing up. I don't even know that I want to keep showing up. I am in the wilderness and it feels lonely and it sucks. Maybe your help just means that you're asking for God's grace to keep strengthening you in the journey. And I want to name one other thing. We've talked about rescue a lot this morning. And we just talked about rescue in that ultimate eternal sense. But there's another kind of rescue that we think about. And a lot of time rescue is like Lindra, where she's in a terrible situation and someone cares enough to reach down and pluck her out of one situation and puts her into another. And that's one form of rescue, and praise God for that. But sometimes rescue looks like the God who's sitting on the mountain and you're down in the valley, not taking you out of the valley, but just coming down into the valley with you. So some of you this morning may need to just say, God, I'm still in the valley. Will you please make yourself more known to me here? Because here's the guarantee of Scripture, of the Exodus story, of our experience, of this plot line of Jesus' redemptive movement from the beginning to now, is that he is never away from you. He's never left you. He's never forsaken you. And so if today you need to say, God, help me to see you in the valley and to quit asking you to take me out of it, but to be content with your presence in the middle of it. God makes all things new, but he doesn't always make new things. Did I say that right? That makes sense? God makes all things new, but he doesn't always make new things. Sometimes it's not about circumstance change, it's about the God who's with you in the valley. So Jesus, in a new, fresh, glass clearing way this morning. May we see you. May we experience you. May we feel you. May we be vulnerable to you in the deepest parts of who we are and our identity and our wholeness and our gaps and our struggles. May we see you in this Exodus story so that we can know who we are. And Jesus, would you help us in this moment, whatever word that you're speaking, whatever thing you're doing in human hearts, would you, in the gap between my words and the singing of words, not let that be a space to tune out and to turn off and think about what's next. Help us to be present to the moment. And whatever you're doing, make it real.